International and Company Regulation. Introduction. This portion of the RNP Approach course will cover specific procedures and limitations used on Airbus fleet to accomplish RNP approaches. General principles for non-precision RNP approaches. There are three types of non-precision approaches authorized: RNAV, GPS, RNAV, GNSS, VOR, NDB. RNP approach operations correspond to RNAV, GNSS, or RNAV, GPS operations. Approach procedures with vertical guidance barometric vertical navigation, APV, BARO-VNAV, are classified as instrument approach procedures for approach and landing operations with vertical guidance. These procedures are published with a decision altitude, height, and must not be confused with non-precision approach procedures, which specify a minimum descent altitude, height, below which the aircraft must not descend. There are three methods to fly non-precision approaches for the Airbus family aircrafts. The FMS is designed to use the following three non-precision approach strategies. LNAV, VNAV. This method can be used to fly either RNAV, GPS, or VOR approaches. The FMC steers the aircraft both laterally and vertically in the final app mode. LNAV, VS. This method can be used to fly all approaches, and is the only method used for a lock approach and circling approaches. The FMC steers the aircraft laterally while the pilot steers the aircraft vertically. LPV 200. Supporting PBN navigation specification RNP approach down to LPV minima, DH, as low as 200 feet. In compliance with Category 1 Precision Approach Performance Requirements of ICAO Annex 101. Note: RNP approach procedures allow four minima lines: LP, LNAV, LNAV VNAV, and LPV. The RNP approach procedures are published on charts with the title RNAV, GNSS or GPS, RWYXX. EGNOS is the European Satellite-Based Augmentation System, SBAS, that complements the GPS system. To use LPV, EGNOS must be available, your aircraft properly equipped and the aerodrome approved with minima. The LPV 200 based procedures will be published on approach charts titled RNAV, GNSS, as current LPV approaches. From December 2022, ICAO expects all RNP approach procedures will only be titled RNP. Required RNP approach equipment. The minimum equipment required to start RNP approach operations is 1 FMGC, 1 GPS, 2 IRS, 1 MCDU, 1 FD, 1 PFD on the PF side. 2 NDs. The temporary display of ND information via the PFD ND switch is permitted on PM side. 2 FCU channels. Pilot procedures for flying an RNP approach. The pilot in command shall verify the correct RNAV, GNSS procedure was loaded by comparison with the approach charts via the map display. This check must include the waypoint sequence, and the tracks, altitudes, speeds, distances and course of the final approach segment. The pilot in command should brief from left to right across the MCDU. 0.1 degree of difference between the MCDU and the charted final vertical path is acceptable. 1 degree of difference between the MCDU and the charted final lateral track is acceptable. Select the CSTR on the EFIS control panel. Pilots must have a local altimeter setting and the temperature must be within limits. Apply cold weather altitude corrections if temperature not within limits. Increase FAF altitude. Increase step-down altitudes. Increase approach minimums. If the field temperature is below the BARO-VNAV temperature, the LNAV minimums must be used, DDA equals MDA plus 50, with the procedure owned with VS or FPA. Derived decision altitude, DDA, MDA plus 50, must be used when VS is engaged below FAF. This value is entered in BARO field on the FMGC Perf app page. Verify RNP 0.3 prior to FAF. Note: normally 0.3 RNP is shown automatically on MCDU 2 nautical miles before FAF. To minimize crew workload, it is recommended to insert 0.3 RNP prior to the commencement of the approach. If an RNP value has been manually loaded, it will not change to the default settings until you delete it. Use LNAV or VNAV minimums for RNAV, GNSS approaches. Enter the appropriate wind correction on the Performance Ref page. Prior to the approach, check RAIM availability using the Predictive GPS McDo page. RAIM is available worldwide if 24 or more GPS satellites are operative. The prediction status is given for a period of 15 minutes before the ADA, until 15 minutes after arrival in 5-minute intervals. RAIM must be available in order to have GPS condense level as primary at the time the NPA is going to be on. If it not the case, then plan on an alternative approach using ground-based navaids. Before starting the approach, check that GPS primary is available on both MCDUs. Note: while maneuvering for the approach, which ATC imposed on heading, altitude, and airspeed should be accomplished by using the FCU inputs rather than by reprogramming the FMC. Prior to approach clearance, use LNAV, heading, or track as appropriate for lateral guidance. Once cleared for the approach, ensure the FMGC is properly sequenced and approach is armed or arm if already with 100 feet of the FAF. Approach must be armed prior to the FAF. During an RNP approach, approximately 3 to 5 nautical miles from the FAF, configure the aircraft. Consider being fully configured and at WIAP by the FAF. Always comply with stabilized approach criteria. NAV, FPA. Guidance should be stable at FAF. Select the Track FPA Flight Director display mode no later than the FAF. Recommend waiting until established on final in order to comply with ATC directed headings prior to final. Intercept final path no later than the FAF in order for the aircraft to be correctly established on the final approach course before starting descent. It is recommended to arm final app mode when the takeoff waypoint is the FDP. Approaching the FAF fully configured, verify that the proper TO waypoint from the ND. When approach is armed, engaged, verify that the vertical deviation scale and index appear on the PFD and the top of the descent arrow changes from white to blue and is depicted near the FAF, FAP. FMAs, final is armed, and approach nav is armed or engaged. Crossing the top of descent, blue arrow, final app automatically engages and the aircraft starts a descent. FMAs display, speed, final app. Be prepared to use VS at the determined rate from the FAF if VNAV will not engage or cannot be maintained. FCOM Aircraft Systems Autoflight, Flight Guidance AP, FD Common Modes, Approach. Final app mode engages when NAV or app nav is engaged. Final is armed by pressing APPR on the FCU. Predictions are available in FMS. Approach phase is active, and the deceleration point has sequenced. Note: approach phase may have to be manually activated on MCDU perf page if the approach starts at high altitude above aerodrome level, for example, RNAV, RNP, approaches. The aircraft is within the capture area of the FMS profile. Laterally, plus or minus 1.5 nautical miles from the final descent point. Vertically, plus 150 feet above the final descent point. The aircraft intercepts a descending leg of the vertical flight path. Note: if APPR push button is pressed earlier, final app mode may engage. As a consequence, resulting speed and altitude management in final app may be inappropriate before FDP. AP, FD Common Modes, Approach. A blue arrow is displayed on NDs to indicate where the final app engagement conditions are met and where the final descent will begin automatically. If the same arrow is displayed in white, at least one engagement condition is not fulfilled. Final app will not engage and the aircraft will not descend automatically. Final descent point. Definition of the final descent point, also called vertical intersection point (VIP) for RNAV, RNP approaches, from FCTM procedures, normal procedures, standard operating procedures, approach. PNF cross-check altitude versus distance to runway threshold using the approach chart in the runway entered in the progress page. Note: when appropriate, compare airplane position on the map with ILS, VOR, DME and ADF systems to detect possible map shift errors. As the aircraft descends through 1,000 feet above the TDZE, the PNF calls 1,000, and the PM calls 1,000 feet. PF calls check. Normally the PF sets missed approach altitude in the FCU before. PF set the go-around altitude according to FCOM procedure. When using FPA guidance at the FAF, pull the FPA knob to activate the planned FPA. Leading the FAF by 0.3 nautical miles is an acceptable technique. Start timing, if required. FMAs, SPD, FPA, NAV. Managed, selected approach. Continue on the pre-planned flight path angle unless reliable information, 3-to-1 or published altitudes comparison, indicates the aircraft is high, low. Correction of up to plus or minus 1 degree is allowed. If the aircraft is in high nav accuracy, with local altimetry, and no cold weather corrections, the magenta donut may be used as an aid to the desired path. Managed, selected approach. Limitations on RNP approach. Cross-track deviation limit is 0.3 nautical miles deviation from nav course. VTK limits are plus minus 75 feet, 3/4 deviations from VNAV path. In order to keep TSE within plus or minus 0.30 nautical miles and plus minus 75 feet, 3/4 feet, flight director and/or autopilot should be used during final approach segment. PM monitors the XTK error in VDEV as displayed on the PFD, ND or FMC. At 1,000 feet RA, PF set miss go-around altitude unless the initial missed approach altitude is less than your current altitude. In this case, set the missed approach altitude as soon as you are below it. For minimum use height of the AP, refer to LIM AFS10 autopilot function, at 150 feet AGL or minimum minus 50 feet if the AP is still engaged. The message disconnect AP for LDG pulses on the FMA